John McMullen joins us every day for his daily NFL segment. We got a lot to get into, of course. Todd Gurley, Julio Jones, and the Eagles report to the NovaCare Center tomorrow. John, how you doing on this Tuesday?
Doing well. Trying to enjoy my last few hours before training camp and that awful grind.
So, John, here's the deal. So before we get into Gurley and Julio Jones and all this, I want to ask you about this Pro Football Focus. So Pro Football Focus came out with their ranking. They're ranking different positions around the NFL. They have the Eagles as 18th secondary in the NFL. Their rationale is that because they're listing Sidney Jones at nickel corner, that dilutes their overall grade. So do you claim fair or foul by Pro Football Focus that the Eagles are the 18th ranked secondary in the NFL?
Well, I claim fair when you look at how they do things. For instance, I think they had Patrick Robinson graded as, if not the best nickel corner, number 2 or number 3. So if he were still here, you would have a huge spike. And then Rodney McLeod didn't have a great season last season, one of the few Eagles who didn't. So I understand it. Sidney's unproven, hasn't played. So from their perspective, remember, they're more of an analytics type website. So you have an unproven guy and a guy coming off a bad season. So it doesn't surprise me.
Josh, when you John, Josh is next to me. John, when you look at Sidney Jones coming into the season, obviously he only played in one regular season, which was a meaningless regular season game. What do you envision his role, especially going into training camp, where this is where usually you start to preview what it's going to be week 1 of the regular season?
Well, he's going to be one of the guys you have to watch. If it's the Sidney Jones who was projected to be a top 15 pick before he tore his Achilles, hey, you got to get him on the field, and you got to get him on the field quickly. And somebody with that type of talent is going to be an outside cornerback. They're not going to be wasted in the slot. It's just not going to happen in this league. That's not how it works. So a lot of it depends on the development of Sidney Jones. A lot of it depends on health. People forget he missed the last 5 practices in the spring. He missed the entire minicamp, missed the last 2 OTAs with what Doug Peterson described as lower body soreness, claimed it had nothing to do with the Achilles. But you have to see if this guy can get on the field first, number one. Then you have to see what type of player if he is. If he's truly a top 15 talent, he's going to be playing outside the numbers. Likely Jalen Mills then moves into the slot would be my prediction. If he's not ready to play, then everything else comes into play. People like Devontae Bosby and Avonte Maddox, but the Eagles have to find a nickelback. And as always, the last ditch, you have a great safety net. Because if you have to do it, you can always play Malcolm Jenkins there. You know he can do it. Problem with that is, who's the third safety? Last year had Corey Graham. He's not here. Although he's still out there. He still wants to play. He still could be signed. So there's still a lot of moving parts in that secondary.
John, looking at Carson Wentz, and we've all heard all off season long how good he's looked, and he's really ahead of schedule. But this, training camp is where we're really going to know, obviously, because no one expects him to play in the preseason. Even if he could, I don't think he would. Do you envision a situation where, even though Carson Wentz has looked good all off season, there's a real strong chance that he won't be the opening week starter?
No, not me. I've said from early on I expect him to start week 1. He's the superstar quarterback. He's the face of the franchise. He is the guy. If he's cleared by the doctors week 1, and I think he will be, he plays. Simple as that. There's no argument about it. There's no discussion about that inside the NovaCare complex. That's what it is. I've compared Nick Foles a lot to Vinnie Johnson. And people who are basketball fans and remember the microwave, he was a great scorer, would come off the bench when he got hot. It was spectacular for those bad boy Pistons. But what I say is Carson Wentz is Isaiah Thomas. Nick Foles is Vinnie Johnson. Who do you want? I want the superstar.
John, sticking with the health of the team, we look at the linebackers. Jordan Hicks obviously went down with the season-ending injury last year. He seems to be on his way back. Are you concerned at all with the Eagles' linebacker depth, considering Hicks is injury-prone, Bradham has had bumps and bruises before, and the depth, I mean, it seems a little thin at the moment. Are you worried about that heading into training camp?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what might be the most talented team in football, that's the biggest weakness. There's not a lot of depth at linebacker. You only have two proven guys, Hicks and Bradham, as you mentioned. Hicks has played 3 seasons at the pro level, 2 of them cut in half by injuries. So he is, at some point, you got to label him injury prone. And remember, Nigel's going to be suspended for week 1 at least. So somebody's going to have to be out there as a 3-down linebacker. And the names you're talking about are Corey Nelson and Nate Gary and Camus Grugier-Hill. I mean, that's not Dick Butkus. Let's put it that way. So if you are looking for an issue with this particular team, you start to look at the depth on the back 7 and on the defense, both at linebacker and, as I mentioned, safety.
You look at where they had depth last year, one of the strengths of the team, it had to be defensive line, but they're going to be without Tim Jernigan for a sizable amount of time. They brought in Michael Bennett. We're not sure what he's going to bring to the table, whether he's going to be motivated or he might be one of those free agent busts. How do you see this D-line adjusting with the loss of Tim Jernigan to injury at the moment and also losing guys like Bo Allen and Vinnie Curry?
No, they're still loaded at defensive line, arguably even better. I mean, yeah, you'd prefer Tim Jernigan to be there, and we'll get an update as we get to camp. He was moving around pretty well in the spring. That doesn't necessarily mean anything when you're a 300-pound tackle who's got to be on the interior and hold up against really, really strong people. It just doesn't matter if you can walk around. You gotta have all your strength back. So you're right. He's probably not going to be there week 1, and it's conceivable he won't be there for the entire first half. But they do have Haloti Ngata, who is still a dominant run defender in this league. Even though he's aging, he's a good 2-down player. And then the positive part comes with the versatility of Brandon Graham and Michael Bennett, because they can both move inside on the pass rush. They're very, very versatile. They're very good players. So, I mean, that was the strength of the Eagles' defense last year. The engine, as Jim Schwartz calls it, it's one of the deepest defensive lines in football. It remains so, even without Tim Jernigan. So when he does get back, it's arguably even better than it was last year.
I wanted to switch over to the offense real quick. You look at the wide receivers on this football team. Really, they're only losing Torrey Smith, and they replace him with Mike Wallace. I mean, how do you think he's adjusting to this offense? He seems to be an upgrade over Torrey Smith. But then, I look at some tape from last year. Torrey Smith, in some spots, was pretty productive. In other days, he was non-existent. Do you think Mike Wallace is that big of an upgrade over Torrey Smith, or you think the Eagles are still going to rely on spreading the ball around between the tight ends, the running backs, and every single receiver they have?
Well, they're going to spread the football around. That's one of the strengths as their offense. But Mike Wallace is a big upgrade over Torrey Smith. He's just a better player. And you're right. At times, Torrey, especially in the playoffs, he played better. But during the regular season, very inconsistent catch in the football, not the best route runner. Mike's a far more well-rounded receiver, arguably even faster. Whereas he's gotten in trouble when he was ill-cast as sort of a number 1 wide receiver. He got big money in Miami, got big money, got traded to Minnesota, then he got big money again in Baltimore, and people wanted him to be a number 1 wide receiver. He's not that. But here, you have Alshon Jeffrey, you have Nelson Aguilar, you have Zach Ertz. He's a compliment. And when you're not seeing double teams and you have that kind of speed, on paper, at least, the Eagles should be much more difficult to deal with because, as I said, he's just a much better player than Torrey Smith.
We're talking with John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. Also does national work around the National Football League. You can follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. That's at JF McMullen. John, I want to take it national now, and there's been a lot of teams that have opened camp already. In specific, the Bears and the Ravens. And looking at the Ravens situation, especially with the Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson kind of conundrum, is it fair to say, now the Ravens haven't kept 3 quarterbacks since I believe 2009, but is it fair to say that Jackson, I mean, he isn't automatically the backup? I mean, that's more of a project if you talk to people that have been around their camp, and you wouldn't just rule out RG3 of being the backup and kind of making Jackson the third string?
Yeah, I expect all 3 to be there. And yeah, I do expect them to sort of give Lamar a redshirt year. As I explained before, Joe Flacco's contract is just ill-suited to have a competition. You can't make him a backup and pay him that kind of money, and they can't move on from his contract yet. Second part of that is they're also a pretty good team. So they're not going to be out of the playoff hunt. And there isn't going to be this groundswell to play the young quarterback. So I think for this year, yeah, the most likely scenario is they keep 3, and Joe is obviously the starter. RG3 is the game day backup, and Lamar just sits and learns. And I think that's a great situation for him. I think it's the best possible situation, because if he were drafted a little bit higher, and he was on the Jets or the Browns or the Bills or the Cardinals, teams that have bridge quarterbacks that might be out of the playoff hunt, there's going to be that groundswell to get the young quarterback on the field.
To kind of add on to that, John, because I totally agree with you, and that's how I'm a big Lamar Jackson guy, but I agree that he needs that year to kind of get his mechanics and everything up to speed, especially with the NFL game. But the Ravens are putting in packages for him to kind of do Wildcat stuff, which means I would assume they would try to use it on game day. If he's the third string guy, doesn't he have to be active? I mean, obviously, to do that stuff on game day?
Yeah, you do have to be active, but I caution. Mike Gill kind of brought that up earlier, and I compared it here to last year. If you remember, everyone was really excited. Different position, but the Eagles were doing a lot of that, what they called their 21 pony formation, where Darren Sproles and Donnell Pumphrey were on the field at the same time, and that's sort of like a camp thing. And you get excited about it, and then when you get the pads on, you go, yeah, we can't do that. Somebody's got to block. In this instance, look, that's a camp thing. In this league, it's been a cliche for years, and it's true. That's the reason it became a cliche. If you have more than one quarterback, you don't have any. You don't want to mess with sort of the feel for a veteran quarterback and take him off the field. We've seen it. Other teams try it in the past. It never works. John Harbaugh's too smart for that. That's a camp thing. Everybody will get excited about it. They'll put it in their back pocket. Not say they'll never use it. There could be a situation where they have him active, and if he's there, they might use a trick play, but it's not going to be a consistent part of the offense.
John, I want to stick with the young quarterbacks because I've been meaning to kind of get your take on this, and it's been a while since we talked after the draft. Looking at all these first-round quarterbacks and all their landing spots that they've landed, how do you see the season shaping out for all of these guys, the Rosens, the Darnolds, the Mayfield, the Jackson? How do you see this season only, shaping out for all those young guys?
Well, I think all the teams actually, for once, did a really good job getting a capable bridge quarterback. So if you look at the Jets, they have Josh McCown and possibly Teddy Bridgewater. Could be one or the other. Bills brought in A.J. McCarron. Browns brought in Tyrod Taylor. Cardinals brought in Sam Bradford. So they all have capable bridge guys. That means nobody has to be forced on the field week one. The higher you are in the draft, obviously it starts with Mayfield and then Darnold. The higher you are, the more pressure it is to get you on the field, especially if it's a bad team. We know the Browns are going to be bad. We know the Jets are going to be bad. The question is how bad. If they're, 1-7, they're going to play the young guy. If they're in the hunt, they'll probably hold it off as long as possible. Same thing in Buffalo with A.J. McCarron. Now, Arizona, we all know Josh Rosen might be the most likely to get on the field first because we all know Sam's going to get hurt. So he might be the one guy who gets on there first. But even they have Mike Glennon as well. So that's another curveball to throw into that equation. So each team has done a good job getting bridge quarterbacks so they don't have to force guys to be on the field. And remember, a lot of the quarterbacks at the top aren't even signed yet. So if you get into camp late, that creates another issue.
John, I wanted to talk actually about contracts this offseason, and these two running backs actually tie into each other a little bit. Todd Gurley just signed this huge extension, and another guy in LeVeon Bell is holding out for a new contract. He doesn't want to sign his franchise tender, says he wants to leave Pittsburgh. I mean, there's a lot of things swirling around here. I mean, what does this Todd Gurley contract mean for other running backs in the NFL? And ultimately, what does it mean for Le'Veon Bell, considering there's a guy across the country who got this huge contract, yet the Steelers cannot commit that type of money to Le'Veon Bell?
Well, I think it's likely this is Le'Veon's final year in Pittsburgh. That was kind of clear when they didn't agree on a long-term deal. They were closer this time, but the Steelers didn't want to go out of whack with that position, which has obviously been devalued over the years. So I think a lot of the running backs are excited with the contract that Todd got, certainly the great running backs. When Ezekiel Elliott's up, Gurley, who was an MVP candidate, obviously Le'Veon Bell was probably the best of them all, at least as a well-rounded back. That's pretty exciting for those, and perhaps Le'Veon can cash in next year in a different city. He'll do what he did last year. He'll sign his franchise tender. Doesn't want to go to camp, and I don't blame him. He doesn't need camp. So he'll wait till the last minute, sign, come in for week one, and he'll have another great year and be able to cash in next year. From the NFL as a whole, though, it's look at the teams that have won the Super Bowl recently, and you don't see a dynamic back. Here, LeGarrette Blount the last 2 years. You don't really have to have a superstar back to win at a high level. At least most of the league thinks that way. So there's this mentality that certain positions, on offense it's running back, on defense it's linebacker, because of the way the game has evolved, they're not as important. And that's, you have to be a dynamic talent like Gurley to get paid. But let's face it, as I said, the lead back on the last two Super Bowl championships teams are LeGarrette Blount, both obviously in New England and Philadelphia. And you really have to go back to Marshawn Lynch probably to find the last sort of real bell cow. And he is not the well-rounded type like Gurley is or Bell is. So I think teams, to be blatant, don't think you need that player.
Now, the more valuable position is wide receiver. Julio Jones holding out right now. I mean, Odell Beckham has said he wants a new contract. What does this mean for Jones and the Falcons? I mean, is there any chance that he would leave at the end of his contract, or do you think the Falcons would be willing to pay him as the highest-paid player in the NFL, at least among receivers? I mean, he seems to be worth that type of money, but then you look at a guy like Odell Beckham, who is equally as good as Julio Jones, perhaps even better in some opinions. He's not getting paid by the Giants right now. How do you foresee this scenario ending for Jones and the Falcons?
Well, it's more difficult for the Falcons. It's two different scenarios. Julio's already been paid. Obviously, when he signed his extension, he was the top paid wide receiver, and that's how it works as it goes on. Guys pass you. As soon as you set the benchmark, the next guy makes more. Now he's got 2 years left on his deal, and he's underpaid. But that's typically the way the NFL does business. You're not going to see an extension until next year, and that's what they've explained to him behind the scenes. We'll take care of you. We know how important you are, but it's a bad precedent to redo a contract with 2 years left. So that's what the Falcons are dealing with. Beckham's different. Obviously, he's on his rookie deal. It's time for him to get an extension. He's argued in the past that he wants to be the highest paid player in football, which just isn't going to happen. I mean, that's just he's never going to get paid more than quarterbacks. So you really just got to hammer it out and go back and forth. Obviously, he's one of those guys that when he does sign his extension on that particular day, he will be the highest paid receiver in football. So he will set that new benchmark. It's just a matter of what it is.
Now, I hate to bring this up, but when you look at what the Dolphins did the other day with this anthem policy, it seems like it's an issue that we want to stop talking about. No one's really bringing it up, and then either one team is going to do something or, God forbid, the president does something. But in terms of this anthem issue, I mean, the NFLPA and the NFL said we're going to table it now. I mean, do you ever see this going away in the near future, or do you think this is an issue that's going to last now for years, considering the Dolphins have personally said we're going to do something about it? Do you think other teams follow suit? Do you think other teams go against Miami? I mean, where does this go from here?
No, I don't. I think the league, I can't say they learned from their mistake because they never seem to learn, but I thought at the end of the last season it had gone away, essentially. TV broadcast had stopped paying attention. Very few players had continued to protest. It was under 10. Nobody was talking about it. Then the NFL comes up with a policy that was unnecessary. The Dolphins really didn't do anything except report to camp, and it was reported wrong. You have to – every team, when they report to camp, has to, as a procedural move, explain their disciplinary policies. So it was the league who kind of fended it off on the teams, and then the Dolphins simply filled out their paperwork and made mention that the worst you could do to a player is suspend him for 4 games. They never had any intention of doing that. It was just reported incorrectly. So the Dolphins part of it's kind of a red herring. The league made a mistake. The best case scenario is that the league talks to the players and realizes, you know what, this is not a big deal. If 10 players want to do what they want to do, ignore it, just move on, and the president will stop talking about it, and it will go away. We'll see if the league is smart enough to realize that.
Agreed. John, me and Josh was having this conversation earlier about the NFL players and them getting paid and what their value is, et cetera, et cetera. I really want to get your take on this because, again, I believe the NFL players should be paid more, but that's under the assumption that hopefully they can open up the salary cap more, do different things with that. Not under, NFL players aren't going to get NBA money. It's just not realistic. It's just not going to happen. But I do believe that players should get more guaranteed money, especially in the NFL where, year to year, they can just cut you and, there's no real big ramifications sometimes.
Well, yeah, there is. And that's why I never criticize people like Julio Jones for trying to get as much money as they can because you have a short shelf life to do that. There could be, I've talked about this a lot, there could be guaranteed contracts, but what you're going to trade if you want guaranteed contracts is they're going to be smaller lengthwise. You're going to be talking about 1 and 2 year deals. You're not going to see 5, 6 year deals with those big upfront massive bonuses. So it's sort of a trade-off. You can imagine, and I always use quarterback as the obvious position, but people always talk about the injury rate and that's why players should have guaranteed contracts. That's exactly why they don't have guaranteed contracts. Because you can imagine the Vikings signed Teddy Bridgewater. He was on his way to a $20 million a year deal, and he had that catastrophic injury, and they signed him to a 6-year deal. Well, now you have to pay him $120 million, and then your fan base is going to expect you to go out and get another $20 million quarterback. Now, I realize people think the NFL prints money, but you ain't going to be printing money if you got to hand out a couple of those contracts and you see no value and those players don't play for you. So the injury rate is the reason there isn't guaranteed contracts, not the reason there should be. However, if you cut that down to 1 or 2 years, you can get guaranteed contracts. So it's just players have to ask themselves what they want. And remember, rookie deals for first-round picks are essentially guaranteed now. They get that money. So it's kind of a false narrative that there's no guaranteed contracts. But obviously, when you compare it to other sports, as you mentioned, Deshaun, it's never going to be that way. And when you talk about the whole cut of the pie, look, they should be paid more than NBA players because it's a more popular sport. But remember, NBA players get 51% of the revenue, and NFL players get 48%. So if you want to argue percentages, NFL should fight for 52%. But that's what the goalpost should be.
Wow, great insight.
John McMullen joins us each day at 4 o'clock on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen, JF McMullen on Twitter for all of your Eagles and NFL coverage. Of course, you can check out his Eagles coverage at 97.3ESPN.com and his NFL coverage at Get More Sports. John, training camp is tomorrow, so we know we're talking to you tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
At first practice on Thursday at noon, high noon.
Sounds like a hot day. John, stay hydrated.
All right. I will do my best. Thank you, guys.